Thank you, Alice, and thank you to everyone else on the panel and everyone attending, and thank you to Sophie, because you touched upon on the last point, the main points that I will be talking about, which is this suppression of freedom of speech, and particularly how PREVENT is used to suppress pro-Palestinian activism in particular. So I'll quickly do a background to what PREVENT is and what PREVENT looks like with regards to how it fits into the counter-terrorism strategy and why it's so relevant, particularly to what is happening today with Palestine. So PREVENT is one arm of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy, and it is unique in the sense that it is completely pre-criminal. So there are four arms: protect, prepare, and pursue, and then there's PREVENT, and PREVENT sits in a pre-criminal space. And to most people, when they think of pre-criminal, they think, oh, before a crime. No, it's pre-criminal in a space of time way before any type of crime. In fact, there's no preparation, there's no planning, there's no intent. And when people are referred to PREVENT and they are visited by PREVENT officers who are essentially counter-terrorism officers, they even admit that this person has done nothing wrong and they're under no suspicion. So it acts in a time and space which is, applicable to 4-year-olds and 8-year-olds. And this is why we've had children that young being referred to PREVENT. And yet PREVENT's objective is supposed to be stopping people from being drawn into terrorism. That's what it says on the tin. That's its ultimate objective. So how do people get stopped from being drawn into terrorism? It relies on risk factors, and these risk factors are called extremism risk guidance factors. So this idea of extremism is a slight step away maybe from what has been discussed so far, because we've been speaking about terrorism, but it's so intrinsically linked, and ultimately is the problem that we face in the UK when we're trying to speak about issues around Palestine, because you're either a terrorist sympathizer, or you're extremist, or you're associated with extremist, or you're lending support to extremism. And so it is a term that we are constantly being beaten with, and yet it's a term that has no legal definition, and it doesn't even have an agreed upon non-legal definition. So the PREVENT duty is something that has been a statutory duty for doctors, teachers, and any other public sector worker since 2015 in the UK. So if anybody is showing signs of radicalization, then a teacher, doctor would have a legal duty to make a referral, regardless of the age or the mental or physical capacity of their patient or their student, to the PREVENT duty. And these risk factors, these extremism risk factors, I will give you examples of some of them: a need for identity, meaning, and belonging, desire for status and a need to dominate, going through a transitional phase or personal crisis, having an obsessive, angry desire for change or wanting something to be done, and having mental health issues. And you can see why thousands of referrals are made every year, approximately 6,000 to 7,000, but we believe that's a very conservative number that the Home Office give. And we have evidence that many referrals have been made and not been documented. Now, of course, these risk factors rely on people's biases, whether those are conscious or unconscious biases. They disproportionately impact Muslims and ethnic minorities. When it comes to pro-Palestinian activism, it is very clearly seen as part of an extremist view. And extremism, the non-legal definition of extremism that we have at the moment, is a vocal, active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. So this fundamental British values is a crucial part of what teachers and educators have to actively promote. As of 2014, they have to actively promote these in schools. And so it's really interesting that you have a problem with freedom of expression in education, particularly within higher education, whether it's for students or academics, because they are ultimately taking part in what we previously knew as democracy. And yet somehow it's supposed to be opposition to democracy, if you look at it in terms of what extremism suggests it is. Now, PREVENT has had a very long affair with pro-Palestinian activism, and a key figure that comes up consistently when we look at the dates and the chronology of certain activities that have happened under the banner of extremism when it comes to curtailing pro-Palestinian activism is Michael Gove. Now, Michael Gove was previously the Education Secretary, And he's been quoted as saying, "Why shouldn't you be a Zionist? It's common sense." Now, in 2011, Gove intervened in shutting down a literary festival of workshops celebrating Palestinian literature and human rights. And he did this via his Department of Prevention of Extremism unit. It was a festival that was being organized by a Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And I believe at least 8 of the schools that were going to send students to this festival were stopped from doing so. I mean, they were asked to justify why they were doing so. And of course, they decided not to send their students after all. So just that fear of knowing that you're being questioned and you're being asked to justify why you're taking students is enough for many institutions to fall back and say, actually, we're not going to take part. In 2014, the Trojan Horse Affair, for those of you who are unaware of what the Trojan Horse Affair, it was a hoax that basically suggested that there were schools in Birmingham where children were being Islamicized. He was a key figure in commissioning somebody to investigate the Trojan Horse Affair. And he commissioned Peter Clark, and Peter Clark's report, which was published in 2014, actually used the PREVENT definition of extremism to categorize an Orthodox Jewish group as extolling extremist views because it was anti-Israel. And in 2015, when PREVENT was put on a statutory footing, Gov was already talking about proposals to suppress the support for the BDS movement. And of course, now we know that the BDS movement has come into effect. And if you're a public body, you can't support boycotts. If you're individual organization or individual group, then you can, as well as an individual, but as a public body, you cannot. In the following year, in 2015, of course, we know, that PREVENT came in as statutory duty, PREVENT policy was developed, and to date, no anti-Palestine views have ever been censored as extremist, right? Only in the opposite direction. So there is a new definition actually for extremism that has been proposed, again, by Michael Gove. And this new definition is that extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology which aims to overturn or undermine the UK system of parliamentary democracy, its institutions and values, or threatens the rights of individuals, or creates a permissive environment for radicalization, hate crime, and terrorism. And I'll loop back around to that, which is currently being discussed as a new definition for extremism. I don't think there will ever be a legal definition for extremism because it allows, and it has allowed, for the goalposts on what is considered extremist to constantly be moved. And this is 100% relied upon in terms of how people are referred to PREVENT and what is being seen as a PREVENT issue. So I'll speak about some cases of PREVENT previously that were linked to pro-Palestinian activism, and then I'll speak briefly about what is happening today and what we're seeing on the ground today. So in 2016, there was a schoolboy in Luton who was referred to PREVENT for wearing a pro-Palestinian wristband, right? Teachers referred him to PREVENT. It was extremely embarrassing for PREVENT to be associated with this type of referral. And after that referral, it was very high profile. Of course, they tried to suggest that, there were other issues happening, and there weren't. This was a well-documented case that they tried to suggest was a myth and had been glorified as something more than, less than what it actually was. In 2021, we saw 2 years ago, when people were, particularly school students, young school students, were showing activism with regards to what had happened in Sheikh Jarrah in Palestine. A 12-year-old girl was one of many people who had contacted PREVENT Watch, and she was questioned by police for creating a WhatsApp group which was expressing solidarity with Palestine. Now, of course, there were other students in the group, things were said, but none of those things that were said crossed the boundary in terms of what would be considered a hate crime or anti-Semitic or anything extremist. However, she was taken to a room by her teacher. An officer was on the other side of the table, as she describes, and this audio is on our website, where the young girl herself, the 12-year-old, describes what happened. She said, "Teacher took me in the room, left me with the officer, shut the door behind her, and left me alone to be questioned by this officer. And this officer said to this girl, we're actually doing you a favor by questioning you at school, because really we should be taking you down to the station." Her parents were unaware of what was happening. They had not received any consent, and there was no guardian or adult in the room other than that officer, which is a clear breach of what officers should be doing, which is they should be following protocol PACE 1984, which suggests that children should have a guardian or adult with them. Of course, because they're not investigating a crime, because Prevent sits within the pre-criminal space, this was their excuse when a complaint was raised. They said, well, we weren't investigating a crime, we weren't wearing our police hat. Well, which hat were you wearing when you were questioning a child of 12 years old and suggesting that they were going to be down at the police station? So in 2021, again, whilst all of this activism was happening, the counter-extremism unit, we have evidence to show that they were actually behind a lot of the directions to schools in terms of how to deal with activism. And there were numerous exclusions, suspensions, detentions for people, you know, drawing a flag on their hand, for trying to fundraise, et cetera, et cetera. So the schools were doing the sanctions. It wasn't obviously Prevent, and I believe that was a deliberate attempt to try and hide their involvement because of the embarrassment of being involved in something like this. They couldn't possibly justify why they would be shutting down activism. Now, in 2023, we're sitting here today, you know, we've had almost 2 months of post the 7th of October. And within the first few days, it was the Monday, actually, after the attacks. In the Monday after the attacks, what happened at school was that a young autistic boy, 8-year-old, now remember, he's a young Muslim boy, so he's already at risk in the mind of the person making the referral. He has autism, so again, he has an issue already at risk. Was sitting in primary school in year 4, and the teacher decided to play a news round clip in front of the students. And the boy reacted inappropriately. He said, yay. He shouted out, yay. He was immediately referred to Prevent for this. No reasonable adjustment was made for the fact that he is an 8-year-old autistic boy. It was straight away Prevent referral. He wasn't spoken to about it as part of the school. Now, the school, once the parents had raised the complaint, immediately accepted that this was a disproportionate referral. But what they said was really interesting. They said that the reason we made this disproportionate referral was because of the letters that we received from the borough telling us that we needed to refer people to Prevent. So what were these letters? These letters were sent by police. They were sent by local authorities to schools. And essentially what they said was that, bearing in mind your Prevent responsibilities, Hamas is now a prescribed terrorist organization. So in 2021, when the activism was happening in May, June, they hadn't been prescribed yet. They were only prescribed later in that year of 2021. So now that they are prescribed, and the wording was, with our Prevent duties in mind, it's important to note that Hamas are prescribed as a terrorist organization in most Western countries. It may be that your students have strong polarizing opinions. As per our recent Prevent training, I would ask that we all be vigilant to any comments that could be considered discriminatory, inflammatory, anti-Semitic, or Islamophobic. Now, this had teachers making Prevent referrals in a flood, and this flood was actually admitted in an article just earlier this week. The chief of the Metropolitan Police, terrorism chief of the Metropolitan, said that they had received a flood of referrals and that 70% referrals had come in since the 7th of October. Now, he was suggesting that this was evidence that, you know, we're catching people who are about to commit terror offences, but of course, Prevent doesn't sit in that space at all. And in fact, it's a direct reflection of them harnessing a lot of fear and a lot of bias and allowing for teachers especially to use this securitized outlet for people who are showing any activism. Same was happening to universities, where vice chancellors received a letter from the Secretary of State for Education, reminding them of their need to exercise the Prevent duty, as well as be vigilant about speakers being invited to speak on campus. So in the same time that the Met chief of terrorism was saying that, you know, we've received this flood of Prevent referrals, we actually also saw a letter just published 2 days ago from Waltham Forest Council. Now, Waltham Forest Council is a local authority that receives additional Prevent funding because they're seen as a borough which has a high number of Muslims living in that borough and therefore require extra Prevent funding in order to make sure that they're making those extra Prevent referrals. Now, they had to send out a letter to schools saying to them, can you please not make referrals unless you really think that the person is being radicalized? So they had to say that because of the fact that they were receiving such a huge number of these misinformed referrals. So it's really interesting because this new definition of extremism is something that has been determined by government. It's not in law, you can't challenge it, and yet you can be labeled an extremist. And that smear sticks with you. And of course, extremism is way too associated with terrorism for nobody to also just use those terms interchangeably. And we have to wonder if we can take a government seriously that has defined extremism when they themselves would be classified as an extremist because of the way in which they undermine democracy, because of the way in which they threaten the rights of individuals, and because of the way they have created a permissive environment for hate crime. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.